Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about turning what was a closed canopy, mature hardwoods, into a preferred deer bedding area. We've made a couple similar videos in the past as we've created bedding areas on our previous property, but because this is a new property, it felt like a good idea to kick things off with another video on creating bedding areas within timber, as that's one of the projects that we're going to be working on this coming off season. But before we start talking about how to actually create the bedding area itself, I did want to talk about the most important thing when it comes to using a chainsaw for anything, and that's following chainsaw safety. If you're not comfortable using a chainsaw, find somebody else to do the work. But if you are going to be using a chainsaw yourself, just make sure that you are following all the safety procedures. You're wearing chaps, gloves, steel-toed boots, you have a helmet on. Accidents can happen, guys, and you just want to make sure that you're following all the safety procedures so that if an accident does happen, that you don't end up really hurting yourself over creating deer habitat. But now let's talk about creating the bedding area and the steps that I take to turn what was a closed canopy, mature hardwoods into preferred deer bedding. And the first thing I want to touch on before we even talk about cutting trees is the location of your bedding area. And every property is going to be a little bit different when it comes to deciding where to put bedding areas. But for the most part, you're going to be following certain themes, and there are certain things that you kind of want to make sure that you're taking into consideration before you're choosing a location for that bedding area. And the first one is your access. How are you going to get to and from your stand locations on your property? And if you put a bedding area in a certain location, are you going to be able to exit your stands in the morning and access your stand locations in the afternoon without getting too close to that bedding area? Just like with a food plot, if you have to get too close to or walk through these bedding areas when you're walking to and from your stand locations, when there's a high probability of deer being inside the bedding areas, you're going to have a higher probability of spooking deer in your property, which is going to add pressure to your property, which is going to lower the chances that you're going to have consistent daylight deer movement. And again, every property is going to be laid out a little bit differently. Just try to make sure that you're taking your access into consideration before you're choosing a location for these bedding areas. I find that on the properties that I've hunted, I can get within 50 yards of these bedding areas as long as you have adequate screening without spooking deer within the bedding areas. Another thing to think about when choosing a location for your bedding area is how do you want these deer to move through your property? When cutting bedding areas, you're going to be putting a lot of timber on the ground, which is going to destroy a lot of the existing deer travel on your property, while at the same time promoting travel along the edge of that bedding area. So if you have a trail or a travel route that you're trying to promote on your property, build that bedding area just off to the side of that travel route, which is going to strengthen that movement. To give you guys an example of where I decided to put this bedding area on our new property, we cut it just on the north side of our main food plot system, which is going to be more towards our house where I expect the deer to be hanging out throughout the night. We also cut the bedding area just on the north side of a new travel route that we want the deer to take, which is going to be just on the south side of this bedding area. But now let's talk about actually creating the bedding area. How do you take what was a closed canopy hardwoods and turn it into preferred deer bedding? Well, I guess the first thing that we need to kind of answer is what is preferred deer bedding? Deer really want thick, high stem count, secure cover. And open hardwoods, mature hardwoods, closed canopy woods, that is the complete opposite of what deer prefer to bed in. There's nothing growing on the ground, there's no food, it's not thick, you can see for hundreds of yards. That is the last place a deer wants to bed down during the hunting season. And the reason there's nothing growing on the ground, there's no browse, there's no early successional growth, it's not thick, is because there's no sunlight hitting the forest floor. Those mature trees are closing the canopy, preventing any sunlight from hitting the forest floor. So the number one way to create those preferred bedding conditions in an open hardwoods is just to get sunlight to the forest floor. Without sunlight hitting the forest floor, you're not going to get that early successional growth. You're not going to get that thick area that the deer prefer to bed in. So the first step that I take when trying to create a preferred bedding location on my property is I go in and I drop all the large mature trees, just traditionally fell those trees in that new bedding location. There's a few reasons as to why you want to be dropping these larger, more mature trees first. And the first reason is because they're blocking the most sunlight. The more of these large trees you can get on the ground, the more you're going to open that area up to sunlight. It's going to have the greatest impact within the area and stimulate and promote more new growth. The second reason that you want to be dropping these larger trees first is because if you do the detail work first that we're going to be talking about next, prior to dropping the larger trees, what you're going to notice is you didn't open up the area enough to sunlight. The larger trees that you had left standing, they're going to fill in the gaps that were made by those smaller trees that you've dropped. And again, it's going to choke out that area and deprive it of sunlight, and you're not going to get any new growth. And so you're going to have to end up cutting those trees anyways. And if you cut those larger trees after you do the detail work, like with hinge cutting those smaller trees, those big trees come down very hard and they're going to smash through all the detail work that you did, destroying everything that you worked on. So again, the first step in creating a bedding area within a closed canopy, mature hardwoods, is to go in and drop as many of those large mature trees within that desired bedding location as you can. We kind of just touched on it, but once you have all those larger mature trees that you want to cut down inside your bedding area, the next step is to go in and either traditionally fell or hinge cut those smaller to medium-sized trees. And when you are doing the detail work and you're hinge cutting the trees within the bedding area, there are a few guidelines that I like to follow here as well. Just like we want to drop those larger mature trees before we're doing any of the detail work, I also like to start hinging those larger trees and then working my way down to the smaller trees. And it's for the same reason. The larger the tree, the harder, the faster it's going to come down. It's going to come down with more force. And if you're doing detail work on those smaller trees first, and then you bring down a larger tree on top of that, you just have a greater probability that that larger tree is going to break or destroy the work that you previously did. So again, once I get to the point where I'm comfortable hinge cutting trees, I still like to start hinging those larger trees and then work my way to those smaller trees. Another thing that I'm making sure that I'm doing when I start the hinge cutting work within these bedding areas is that I start with lower cuts and then work my way to higher cuts. I kind of picked this location for the video to kind of give you guys an example of this. I cut the larger trees first and I start with lower cuts. This is kind of a waist high cut, and then I work my way to higher cuts. This is a smaller tree. It was cut later, and it's a little bit of a higher cut. The cut was made right about shoulder height. And you want to be doing this for a few reasons. One, you want to kind of build your hinges on top of each other. And so if I cut this tree higher, that means that the following cut would have to be even higher than that. And if you have too many high cuts, you're going to be able to see right underneath all those hinge cuts. You're not going to be offering much for security. So I prefer to start with lower cuts on the larger trees, getting that cover closer to the ground, and then I build on top of that and cut a little higher as I move towards the smaller trees. And hopefully you guys can kind of see that a little bit with what's going on behind me. I hinge cut this tree lower, dropped it on top of a stump of a tree that I traditionally felled, and then this tree is a little bit smaller, cut it a little bit higher to build on top of it. I like to have varying levels of cover within my bedding areas, which is another reason why I like to cut at different heights. I like to have these low cuts for that lower cover, that screening cover, and I also like to have a few higher cuts, again, to build on top of those lower cuts to provide more overhead cover. Because I varied the heights and the cuts and cut this one a little bit higher, that makes it a lot easier for the deer to get around in certain parts of the bedding area. Right now I have a nice open area right here. There's not really a whole lot of restricted movement for the deer. If I would have cut this tree right here at waist high, that would have blocked this area and it would have been a lot harder for those deer to move around. The same thing with this kind of passageway I have, this little escape route that I have back there. If I would have cut that any lower, it would have been a lot harder to create an escape route heading in that direction. So again, when hinge cutting within these bedding areas, I like to start with those larger trees and work my way to those smaller trees. I like to start on those larger trees, cutting them around waist high, and then I gradually increase the height as I get to those smaller trees. As far as how you should be laying out or how you should be designing this bedding area, how should you be dropping the trees? Which direction should you be dropping these trees? Really what you're going for is you're going for open pockets that are surrounded by cover. And a lot of times you can't really decide which way these trees are going to fall. I don't normally fight tree lean, especially on the larger trees. I don't fight it at all. Whichever way it wants to go, that's the way that I'm going to drop that tree. And a lot of times what you're going to find out is these pockets kind of make themselves as you drop these larger trees. And once you get to the point where you're going to start hinge cutting those smaller trees and you can actually decide which direction those are going to go because you can pull them one way or another with the habitat hook, you can actually push them away from those open pockets. So you have an open pocket in the bedding area, and you can a lot of times hinge cut those smaller trees away from that open pocket. And if you're able to hinge cut kind of away from the center of those open pockets, that's gonna do a couple things for you. One, it's not gonna destroy that open pocket. The deer are still gonna be able to move freely through there, bed down in there. And two, you're gonna offer a lot more sunlight into that area because you drop down all those trees. And the third thing you're gonna do is you're gonna create screening along the outside of that open pocket as you're dropping the tops towards the outside. And if you're able to get a successful hinge, those tree tops are going to leaf out, creating a living wall surrounding that open pocket within the bedding area. And that scenario is in a perfect world where you have fairly straight trees and you can kind of cut or push those in any direction that you want. In reality, that's not going to happen every single time. You're going to either have trees that are too big that you can't really decide which way they want to go because they're leaning one way. And in those scenarios where you don't really have an option on which way the tree is going to fall, it's leaning too heavily, you know, just drop it or hinge the tree in that way. And if you can make it work with your bedding area, great. If it's blocking a path or if it's blocking an opening, that's okay. Just cut it up and get it out of the way. But again, what you're trying to create when you're cutting one of these bedding areas on your property is you want to make sure that you have a lot of open areas surrounded by cover with a lot of escapes or ways in and out to those open areas. So I might have an open pocket here surrounded by cover, and then I might have an escape route here, I might have an escape route here, and then on the other side of that escape route, I might have another area that's open. And that area might have a couple different escape routes to other areas. So the end result is very similar to a corn maze. If you had a lot of different openings within a corn maze, there's just a lot of different ways in and out of these different compartments. And by having these multiple open areas surrounded by the cover, connected by these different escape routes or entrances or exits, that's going to allow multiple doe family groups to bed within this bedding area, or maybe one doe family group will bed in this area but have different options depending on the wind direction. And because you have all the entrances and exits or escape paths within these different compartments, if there is a predator nearby or maybe you're walking nearby, these deer know that no matter what direction that predator is coming from, they can get out the other way. If there's ever a compartment within this bedding area that only has one way in and one way out, there's a very low probability that the deer are going to use that compartment to bed down in, because they know if they go in there and a predator comes in from the only way in, they're stuck. As far as how large you want these openings or these compartments to be within the bedding area, that's going to vary. But I would say, you know, on average, you want to be able to comfortably park a car within one of these openings. Now, you don't want to create a parking lot where you're going to have 4 cars in here, and you don't want it to be so tight that you can't even get like an ATV in here. But if you can comfortably park a car in there, that's just about right for about how big you kind of want this hub or this little opening to be within the bedding area. And an easy guideline that I follow when making the escape routes or the connecting travel between the different compartments is if I can get around in this bedding area, then a deer is going to have no problem. And to give you guys an idea as to what I'm going to do to create a better escape path is right behind me. You can kind of see that there's a little bit of a tunnel underneath these hinged trees, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a lot of those lower branches to make it a lot easier for not only myself, but the deer as well as they move from this area to a compartment on the other side of those trees. So again, if you can move through the area okay without having to crawl on your knees or climb over a bunch of logs, then the deer are going to have no problem getting through your bedding area. And guys, that's pretty much what I'm doing when it comes to the first steps in taking what was a closed canopy, mature hardwoods, and turning that into a preferred bedding location for the local deer herd. Now, this bedding project is far from over, as we still have a lot of detail work that we still need to do to really encourage the deer to bed in this location. So this is going to be another video series as we try to show you guys how this bedding area evolves over time. But that's going to wrap it up for part 1 on taking a mature hardwoods and turning it into a preferred bedding location. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop those in the comment section below. I'll get back to those as soon as I can, and we will see you guys in the next video.